So, hello everyone. 1 minute later, our killer speech will be start.
Shall we start?
Um, okay, so now Professor Suresh will start his killer speech. Let's welcome. Thank you.
Okay. Excuse me. Good afternoon, everyone in Seychelles. Um, here is early morning, and I am Suresh Sethi from UT Dallas. I would like to thank the conference organizers and Suash for this kind invitation. Um, I am sorry that I could not be in Seychelles. I know I very much like to be there. Um, I'm a big traveler. I've been to about 100 countries, but Seychelles has not been one of the countries I ever visited. So I would really like to visit there. Okay. So before I begin, I just want to mention that for many years, the supply chain management and supply chain coordination has been topics that have been basically discussed in a single period setting. And a few years ago, I decided to make a dynamic extension of the supply chain management. And when you do the dynamic extension of the supply chain management, you will need to introduce dynamic Stackelberg games. Now, it turns out that dynamic Stackelberg games are not very highly studied in the literature, not like Nash games. And so one has to also develop required theory for these games. And then what I will do is I will introduce very gently, begin with a very simple supply chain, then introduce and go to the two period, introduce the Stackelberg games. And I will then have two applications, one in production planning and one in advertising. And then I will finish my conclude my talk after that, and then we have an answer for questions and answers at that time. So let's go on. I'm trying to see how to change the slide. There we go. So very simple supply chain. There is a supplier. The supplier decides on a wholesale price. And his decision to wholesale price depends on maximizing his profit. The supplier, the retailer orders some quantity from the supplier because the retailer sells these things in the market, and the order quantity is in the response to the wholesale price. And retailer selects the order quantity to maximize his profit. We all know that when there are two parties, they maximize their own profits separately, then that may not be the best for the whole supply chain. Okay, it's like husband making decisions separately and wife making decisions separately is not good for the household. So their self-serving actions do not maximize the profit of the entire supply chain. This particular inefficiency of decentralized decision making in our literature is called double marginalization. Why? Because the supplier puts a margin on his wholesale, on his cost. So if his cost is $3, he puts, let's say, $2 margin, he sells it, his wholesale price is $5. So he makes $2 on each piece. The retailer then gets it for $5 and sells it for $8. So he puts a $3 margin to sell the goods to the market. Because one person puts one margin, another person puts another margin, this inefficiency is now called double marginalization. And this particular model is formulated as a Stackelberg game in a single period setting, generally speaking. So Stackelberg games are a little bit newer compared to what we know about Nash games. And so first, before I go into the Stackelberg games, I will try to say a little bit about the Nash games and what it means to have an equilibrium in Nash game. You all know the movie Beautiful Mind, which features John Nash, and I will then in that. So in a Nash equilibrium, there are two or more players. A set of decisions by the player is called a Nash equilibrium. If no player can do better by changing his decision while the others stay with their decisions. There's another way to look at it. If a player can do better by changing his decision, knowing that the other people will stay with their decisions, then the set of decision is not a Nash equilibrium. Either definition is fine. So let's now review a famous bar scene in a movie called Beautiful Mind.
Coming, gentlemen. Deep breaths. Nash, you might want to stop shuffling your papers for 5 seconds.
Well, not buy you John beer.
Oh, we're not here for beer, my friend.
Oh. Now I'll still should be moving in slow motion.
Well, she want a large wedding, you think? Should we say swords, gentlemen? Pistols at dawn? Have you remembered?
Oh. What happened? Sorry.
Coming, gentlemen? Deep breaths. Nash, you might want to stop shuffling your papers for 5 seconds.
Well, not buy you John beer.
Oh, we're not here for beer, my friend.
Oh. Now I'll still should be moving in slow motion.
Well, she want a large wedding, you think? Should we say swords, gentlemen? Pistols at dawn? Have you remembered nothing?
Recall the lessons of Adam Smith, father of modern economics.
In competition, individual ambition serves the common good.
Exactly.
Every man for himself, gentlemen.
Yeah, those who strike out are stuck with their friends. I'm not going to strike out.
You can lead a blonde to water, but you can't make a drink.
I don't think he said
All
that.
right, nobody move. She's looking over him. Right, she's looking at Nash.
All right, he may have the upper hand now, but wait until he opens his mouth. Do a lot of stuff.
Oh, yeah, that was the history book.
Adam Smith needs revision. What are you talking about? We don't go for the blonde. They block each other. Not a single one of us is going to get her. So then we go for her friends. But they will all give us the cold shoulder because nobody likes to be second choice. But what if no one goes for the blonde? We don't get in each other's way. And we don't insult the other girls. That's the only way we win. That's the only way we all get laid. Smith said, best result comes from everyone in the group doing what's best for himself, right? That's what he said. Complete. Complete. Okay. Because the best result would come from everyone in the group doing what's best for himself. And the group. Ash, this is somewhere for you to get the blonde on your own. You can go to hell. Governing Don hours, John. Governing Don hours. Adam Smith. What's wrong?
Careful.
Thank you.
So in the movie, Nash thanks the blonde woman for his epiphany, goes home to write his 26-page masterpiece called Non-Cooperative Games. That is where he develops the concept of Nash equilibrium. The four friends, I suppose, act on Nash's advice and they all choose the brunette women. The question is, do their decision form a Nash equilibrium? Well, it turns out that in the movie, the answer is that it is not a Nash equilibrium. Since each friend could gain by going for the blonde woman, while each friend could win by going for the blonde woman while the others stay with their decisions. So it is really Nash equilibrium because every person can do better by changing their decision. Let's move on. So now I'm going to start a simple version of the bar game with only two people and two men and two women. And then I will change this game into a Stackelberg game later to draw the distinction between the two. So consider this game. Tom, the two men, Tom and Dick, and the two girls, Emily and Linda, and everybody likes Emily. And so if you look at it, there are four possible choices. Tom chooses Emily, Dick chooses Emily, Tom chooses Emily, Dick chooses Linda, and so on. And you can see that there are two Nash equilibrium. One is both are shown in purple. One is Tom chooses Emily, Dick chooses Linda. In the other one, the Tom chooses Linda, Dick chooses Emily. Both are Nash equilibrium. In the first equilibrium, as you can see, if Tom deviates, he chose Emily, but if he deviates by going for Linda, he suffers by getting none. Likewise, if Dick deviates by going for Emily, he also suffers the same fate. So by our second definition, we know that by our first definition, we know that it is a Nash equilibrium. Same thing happens for the second equilibrium. So we know what is a Nash equilibrium, and we can kind of test it. We also see that there are two equilibria in this case. Notice Nash equilibrium doesn't tell you how to get there. It only tells you what the equilibrium is and what it is not. Now we come to Stackelberg equilibrium, which was actually written earlier than Nash's thesis, 1934. He wrote a book called Market Structure and Equilibrium, and he created what is called a leader-follower game. When there's a leader, there's a follower, but now after his name, we call such games Stackelberg games. Notice that Stackelberg was not creating this in vacuum. He already had game theory fundamentals from John von Neumann's 1928 paper, and there's also 1944 later book by von Neumann and Morgenstern. But they only developed what's called zero-sum games. So there's a theory here. Zero-sum games came, then came the Stackelberg games, then came the Nash games in some way. Let's take the same game now that we just had and make it a Stackelberg game. So what happens in the Stackelberg game, Tom is now leader and Dick is a follower. Such a game is called a sequential game, and it gets solved by a backward induction. So what is a backward induction? First, we obtain a response function by the follower, which is Dick in this case, for each action by Tom. So the follower decision or the response function is a function of Tom's decision, okay? And I can write that as a functional form, but I prefer to choose here as a tabular form because this speech once was given to laymen who were not game theorists, so I did not use any equation for this part of the talk. So here you can see the function of Emily is Linda, which simply means that if Tom chose Emily, Dick will choose Linda. On the other hand, if chose Linda, Dick will choose Emily. So that's one function. Here's another function. Here's another function. Here's another function. So there are four functions: purple, yellow, blue, and gray. We can actually easily find out that the purple is the best response function for Dick. And given that Dick's best response action is purple, we can see that Tom's best action is then choose Emily, and Dick then gets Linda. So there's only one equilibrium here, Stackelberg equilibrium, which is Tom chooses Emily, Dick chooses Linda, as opposed to two equilibrium in Nash. Now let's see how we decide how this change. So clearly, if Tom deviates, That means if Tom goes from Emily to Linda, he loses. Because when Tom deviates, Dick stays with his response function. Dick doesn't change his response function. It stays with purple. And now let's see what Dick does. If Dick changes his response from purple to yellow or blue or gray, given that Tom has chosen Emily, Dick will also lose. So notice that in testing or in checking for the equilibrium, the Tom's deviation is going from one girl to another girl, just like in Nash equilibrium. But the Dick's deviation is going from one response function to another response function. He's not changing the girl, he's changing the response function. That is the fundamental difference between the Nash equilibrium and the Stackelberg equilibrium. This is the main difference between the two games. Clearly, in the leader-follower game, Tom has the first mover advantage, so he gets Emily, whereas in Nash equilibrium, he can also get Linda. So first mover advantage exists in the Stackelberg game. And I already talked about this main difference. There's one more difference, which is for people in the dynamic games, and we will get to that at slide 24. That is a very subtle distinction as well. Now we go to two-period games. It turns out that when you go from one period to two, we are making a dynamic game. Going from 2 to 3, 3 to 4 only brings in more complexity. Conceptually, it doesn't change much. Conceptually, 1 to 2 is the big leap. 2 to 3 is not a big leap. So we will only, in this particular talk, cover two-period games, although when I give you a definition of feedback Stackelberg game later on, I will give you n-period definition. Okay, so more general definition. So we'll only discuss two types of equilibria when we go to dynamic games, but there are more than two types of equilibria. There are papers I will cite where you can talk about other equilibria, but I will only discuss two in this talk. One is called open loop solution. What is an open loop solution? The open loop solution is solved right at the beginning of the game. So beginning of the game, the supplier will decide on his wholesale prices, let's call W1 and W2. Given W1 and W2, the retailer will have a best response for his order quantity Q1 and Q2. But notice Q1 now will be a function of W1, W2. So Q1, even the first period order quantity may depend on the second period wholesale price. Because if the second period wholesale price is too high, he might order more in the first period. We all know that can happen. The leader continues to have a first mover advantage. What is the drawback? Well, the drawback is that there are uncertainties in these models. For example, let's say if the demand is uncertain, then after one period, the first period demand is realized. But if I were to make a decision right at the beginning of the two periods, then I would not take into account the realization of the demand. But in the second period, I already know the first period demand, and not to take the demand into account is a sheer folly. So you should take the demand into account. So the open loop game are somewhat restricted in that sense, but sometimes you do them because the mathematics of the other game that I want to talk about soon is somewhat more complicated. So you will see the literature solving open loop games because that's the only thing they can do. Mathematically, sometimes the other games are more complicated. But in order for the open loop game to be useful, we have to have a commitment, because supply is a leader and he already made the decision about the wholesale price W1, W2 at the beginning. But after he realizes the demand, he can change his mind. There's nothing to stop him to change his mind. And in that case, these games only make sense when there's a full commitment, which means that supplier makes a commitment not to change the price in the second period. That requires some procedures like a court to enforce those commitments and things like that. And we're not going to get into that. That's another topic altogether. This is the solution called feedback. Here the supplier announces the first period wholesale price at the beginning of period 1, then a solution in period 1 must anticipate what happens in the second period. We will see how that works. In period 2, the supplier announces the second period wholesale price after observing whatever uncertainty there was that gets observed. The retailer responds to supplier's wholesale price period-wise. Each period, he looks at the wholesale price and he decides to order quantity. Okay, so the wholesale price would depend on what supplier announces. Both take into account what is observed at the end of the first period. That means uncertainty gets resolved and everybody has full information, as opposed to new kind of games called mechanism design, where the uncertainty is resolved, where different people have different information, and we're not going to go there as well. We're going to stay with the full information games. The drawback here is that the leader doesn't have a global first mover advantage anymore. The leader only has a period-wise first mover advantage, okay? So those are some of the distinctions I'm drawing between Nash game and Stackelberg game when we get into multi-period setting. First application. In the first application, it's a 2-period game of dynamic pricing. And the uncertainty that I'm going to model is not in the demand, but the uncertainty will be in the cost of production. The cost of production in period 1, and there will be a cost of production in period 2. But the cost of production in period 2 will depend on the cost of product, how much was ordered in period 1, because there's learning going on. More you order in period 1, more you produce, more you learn, more the costs go down in the second period. So that there's a dynamics to the cost. The second thing is I'm going to make this dynamic uncertain. That means the second period cost may be not certain. It will change depending on the first period production, but it may not be certain. It'll be a random variable. Okay, that paper is published already, and so I'm going to, it's available, the reference is there. There is a huge literature of learning by doing. That means more you produce, more you learn, and more the cost goes down. The famous paper is by Wright, 1936, not the Wright brothers. These are different Wright. Direct labor cost of manufacturing on airframe fell by 20% with every doubling of the cumulative output. Every time I show this slide, and there's an airplane picture, people think this Wright is the Wright brothers, but this is not Kitty Hawk, this is not Wright brothers. Okay, there are many reasons why the learning by doing decreases the cost. It's also called experience curve. There's a whole of literature on economics. I am not going to get into that economic. I'm not going to get into the literature, because for us, all we need to know is that there's learning and it's stochastic. That's all we need to know. So learning is dynamic and stochastic. Cost falls with cumulative production over time in a stochastic way. And empirically, the rate at which the observed cost decline tend to vary widely, both across and within industries and even across departments within a firm. And particularly, there is a considerable uncertainty regarding the rate at which the cost will decline. This we all know, those who have lived through semiconductor manufacturing, how the cost of making a chip has gone down over the years, from hundreds of dollars to a small penny. We can see that there was a lot of uncertainty of cost of production in that. So that is something that we're going to assume in this model. Now, in order to see what is going on, we need a benchmark. The benchmark in a supply chain management is a centralized channel, which is a monopolist manufacturer who's producing and also selling. There's no retailer here, okay? So here the learning curve creates an interdependency between product cost and cumulative output. We're going to assume that the demand is price dependent, and we need to find out what is the optimal production quantity in period 1 and in period 2. Clearly, it might appear that I would like to overproduce initially so that I learn more. In order for me to overproduce initially, I would have to sell more. In order to sell more, I have to reduce the price in the period one. So I may reduce the price in period one in order to produce more and sell more in order to benefit in the second period for a lower cost of production. So it is possible that in this model, where manufacturer decides on price and production, he can reduce the price to increase the demand in the first period. And that happens, by the way. If you solve that problem, that happens. But that's a centralized cost. Let's see what happens in a decentralized setting. I'm just going to go through all of that. In a decentralized setting, the manufacturer sells through a retailer. So the retailer sets the retail price, which is the pricing power. And generally speaking, we know due to double marginalization that the retailer actually will charge higher price. And because he charges higher price, he will sell less. So he will order less. And when he orders less, supplier does not benefit from ordering less. And so supplier loses A, because the order is less, and B, because he cannot learn as much. So it is very important in this setting to achieve coordination. That means there is a contract between a supplier and a retailer, and under the contract, they achieve the centralized solution. Such a contract is known as a coordination contract. So in our model, we're going to do all of this. We're going to start with a centralized solution. We're going to do decentralized solution. Then we're going to do a contract. Okay, and that contract will coordinate the channel. And that paper in 2015, by the way, is the first rigorous paper on a two-period supply chain coordination. Okay, so in this setting, the manufacturer will decide on wholesale price and production quantity. I don't know, yeah. Manufacturer decide wholesale and production quantity, and responding to that, the retailer will decide retail price and ordering quantity. Okay, and then he'll sell in the market. And in between the period, the okay, so the paper has both inventory option and no inventory option. We will only cover the no inventory option. That means the manufacturer cannot carry inventory from one period to the next. If he can carry inventory, that's fine. He can produce more in that case, but that is only a little bit more mathematically complicated, but it is conceptually not a big difference between the two. So I'm only going to focus on no inventory option in this talk. The paper has both. Okay, 2 periods. First period is called infant stage, where you learn. The second period is the mature stage, where you sell. This particular setting has been used by famous people who got Nobel Prizes. Freudenberg and Tirol got Nobel Prize. Das Gupta and Stiglitz, one of those, also got Nobel Prize, and another paper by a couple of Brazilians. Demand parameter, AI is the market potential in period I. That means that's the maximum you'll sell regardless of what the price is. And B is the price sensitivity. That means if the price is higher, I will sell less. PI is the retail price in period I, and the WI is the wholesale price in period I. We'll also have a cost parameter. C1 is the production cost in period 1. C2 is the random variable. That will be the cost in production 2. And the small c2 will be the realized cost of production in period 2. And lambda is the learning rate. Production variables, small qi is the retailer's order quantity, and a big qi is the manufacturer's production quantity. We will find out that if manufacturer is not allowed to carry inventory, he will only produce what the retailer orders. So this qi and a small qi will be the same. That will be the case in optimal solution. We will not. The last one is suppressed because we will not be going through the inventory option. Okay. So the 2-period model, here's what happens. The manufacturer will decide on W1 and Q1, wholesale price and production quantity. Both of them know the cost of production. Both manufacturer and retailer knows what the cost of production is. And given this W1 and Q1, the retailer will decide on the price, retail price, and order quantity. After this happens, the learning takes place. And the big C2, which is the cost of production, is realized as a small C2. That's a realization of the cost of production. Everybody can observe that. After they observe that, the manufacturer will decide on W2 and Q2. Once he decides W2 and Q2, the retailer will decide on P2 and Q2, and the game then the price is the product is sold and the game is over. We're going to assume a deterministic demand function, AI minus B times PI, which is a standard demand function. This is the dynamics. C2 is C1 minus lambda times Q1. Lambda is the learning rate. More you produce, more you learn. And what you learn subtracts from the first period cost of production. The second period cost of production is C2. It will be realized as small C2, but that is that. Random learning curve. The random rate is lambda, which is a random variable. The smallest learning rate is 0. The biggest learning rate is small gamma. In this model, we don't need the distribution of lambda. We only need this mean and the standard deviation. That's because the model is too simple. In a more general setting, you will need a whole distribution. Manufacturer will not have an option of carrying inventory. And back orders are not allowed. Manufacturer retails are forward-looking. These are assumptions which are innocuous, and so we don't have to discuss so much. So I'm told that the time is short. Centralized solution is a straightforward dynamic programming. As you can see, this is the revenue, this is the cost, this is the revenue, this is the cost. Revenue is, this is the sale minimum of these two, and that's the price, and there's expected value because this C2 is a random variable. You can find out the P1 star, the price, optimal price, you can find the optimal quantity, you can find the optimal price in the second period, and you can find the total profit. That's our benchmark. So this is very simple dynamic programming, two-period problem. Then we go to the decentralized setting. The decentralized setting, the manufacturer's profit will depend on all these quantities that we already talked about in that picture. And retailer's order quantity will be a function of all these quantities. And the function is, we know it, it is W1 Q1, which is the revenue of the manufacturer minus his cost, and the second period. And for the retailer, it is the revenue and the cost. So it's the revenue minus what he pays to the wholesaler, and so on. And this is the dynamics. And we already know what the decisions are, so we'll go to the next one. This is a slide where I actually give you what is the feedback for a very general setting. And I cannot spend too much time on it, but I can tell you that X is the state variable, which is the same as a C here, is the state variable, which is the dynamics here. So X is the state variable, T is the time at any time. We have an N period problem. So the manufacturer's decision will depend on X and a T at any given time T, and for any given X. And the retailer's decision will depend on the state, the time, and the decision of the manufacturer. And we can write this decision as U with all of N of these. We can write this as V. The feasible space could be U and V because there may be some constraints. And given U and a V, there is a dynamics here. So given U and a V, I can solve this. When I can solve this, I can get a state in every period I, starting with any T. Remember, there is no time inconsistency here. So we have a X, T, Y, which is given with a T and a Y. The state in period I, given the decision U and V, can be solution of these. Once you have that, I can define a profit function. Leader profit function depends on the state and period I, decision in period I, decision of the follower in the period I, the random variable realization, and final salvage value and expected value. Similarly, the decision of the follower can be also decision made by the state, the decision by the two guys, the period I, and all that. Once you have these profits, we can define the Stackelberg equilibrium. For any pair of strategies, U star in U, V star in V, it's called a feedback. So here this is the U star, this is a V star of that. If the follower, if the manufacturer changes the decision from U star to U, he loses. For the follower, if he changes his response function from V star to V, while the other guy stays with U star, so you see V star or V, he loses. And so that is our definition. I only want to say that let's not go about this subtle distinction that happens. So let's not talk about that right now. So I stop that. And so now we can solve the problem in a decentralized setting. As you can see, this is how the decision is acted upon by the retailer and the follower. So the manufacturer will observe C1, the cost, and he will decide W1. Production quantity, he has a table. He solves this problem. Both people solve this problem and create this table. And the production quantity will be Q1 star. Given W1 and Q1, which is announced by the manufacturer, the retailer will have his own table. He will plug in the C1, the W1, not the function, but the actual dollar, W1 and a Q1, and then he will decide the Q1 star. Similarly, he will decide the P1 star. And then when this is decided, the dynamics will realize, and we will both observe C2. Once observing C2, again, the manufacturer will use the table to decide W2 and Q2. Once they gets decided, the retailer will use the table to decide his decision, and we can find out that this profit is going to be less than the centralized profit. So I'm going to develop a revenue sharing contract. The revenue sharing contract is basically the manufacturer will say, this is the revenue share. So let me give you the revenue sharing contract here. So the manufacturer basically gives the phi I portion of the revenue to retailer in each period, phi 1 and phi 2. And given that phi 1 and phi 2, you can see that the profit of the retailer is phi 1 times the revenue minus the wholesale price he pays. And again, phi 2 times the wholesale price he pays. So he's a new problem. But when you solve this new problem, you will see that you can find a contract that will coordinate. So here's the coordinating contract for any phi 1, phi 2 in 0, 1. That means any portion the retailer manufacturer gives to the retailer. If he sets the wholesale price according to this formula and wholesale price in W2 according to this formula, then this is a coordinating contract. That's under this contract, the centralized solution will be realized. Notice that the second one contract is a standard contract because the second period is a single period problem. So it should have the same theory as the theory developed by the single period setting. But in the first period, the wholesale price is completely different than what is developed in the single period literature. This is the Nash equilibrium paper that I will present. That paper was done in 2019. It's published in Science Journal of Control. And it's a thing about cooperative advertising. So let's very quickly go into cooperative advertising. I will go to cooperative advertising. It's an arrangement whereby a manufacturer pays some portion of the cost of the local advertising to the retailer. Okay, and the portion that pays is called participation rate. This is very common in marketing. As you can see, the cost of estimate of cooperative advertising for 2007 was $25 billion. I don't have the data for 2019, but I'm sure it far exceeds $25 billion. You can also see that the average participation rate is 75%. It depends on different industry, and no research exists that decides what is the optimal participation rate. But model that I'm producing, if you have the data, you can actually find out what the optimal participation rate is. So I'm still waiting for my model to be used in an empirical setting once we have the data to see whether we can get these numbers. You can see the IBM pays 50% of advertising costs, Natural Bounty pays 50%. So what should be the rate? There are some papers on the survey papers on co-op advertising, and I will not get into that. So we already talked about what is the equilibrium concept, but what I'm going to do is what is called a mixed leadership game. So this is my game. There's a literature on Stackelberg differential games, but the paper that I'm going to write, because that's where we develop some theory, is my paper with Ben Susan. There are several authors. There are like 4 or 5 authors, and this paper in Science Journal of Control, that's a paper that I'm going to use. So we extend some literature on Stackelberg games. But we have a mixed leadership game, so each player is a leader in some decision, and each player is a follower in some decision. Okay, so we'll get to that game right now. So here's a manufacturer, here's a retailer, here's a retailer, here's a manufacturer. The same guy. So there are only 2 people here. Now, manufacturer decides the participation rate but at the same time, so the retailer does the local advertising. This local advertising is VR. Manufacturer does the national advertising, which is VM. but manufacturer pays part of the local advertising of the retailer, that is a participation rate. Retailer also pays part of the global advertising to the manufacturer, that's UR. So you can see that the game goes like this. Both manufacturer and retailer decide their participation rate, which is in red. Given these participation rates, the retailer and manufacturer decides their advertising, national and local. And so that would be the response function of the function of these two guys. And once these are decided, they will play a Nash game. Nash game gives the response function. Once the response function comes to these guys, they will play a Nash game to get participation rate. So that's a backward solution of this game. Let's continue. The dynamics is given by what is called a Sethi model. It's a model that I did in 1983. It has a Wikipedia presence as well. And this is a stochastic differential equation. It says that the market share depends on the advertising by these two people, and it acts on people who are not buying your product. And there is a deterioration in the market share called forgetting, and there is a Brownian motion, and that gives you the random part of this. Each of the people have their own objective function. This depends on the revenue margin of the manufacturer times the market, and the cost of advertising, the cost of support to the advertising the retailer, and cost of advertising minus what is supported by the retailer. So this is the manufacturer's objective function. Similarly, this is the retailer's objective function. Given that, we have a dynamic programming in continuous time that is called the Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman kind of formulation. So this is your Hamiltonian. This is the objective function times the adjoint variable times the dynamics. Again, the Hamiltonian is by objective function times the adjoint variable times the dynamics. The game is played at the static level and each time. That's called the Hamiltonian game. So the Hamiltonian game, the leader decisions decide, the follower decides. So given these decisions, the follower decides these by maximizing their Hamiltonians, which is just doing by calculus. When you do the first order condition, you find the VM is a function of UR and the VR is a function of UM. These are the response functions. Given the response functions, you put the response function back into the Hamiltonian, then the manufacturer has a problem in UM and UR. So manufacturer will maximize this Hamiltonian, retailer will play this Hamiltonian, and they will play a Nash game. And we have a solution for UM and a solution for UR. So what now we have solution at each point in time t. We have to now put the dynamics. So we go back into what is called the differential equation called the Hamilton-Jacobi equation. So there you can see this is the equation for the retailer. This is the equation for the manufacturer. This is called the value function. And this is the Hamiltonian. And wherever there was an adjoint price, we know the adjoint price is a derivative of the value function. So we'll put the derivative here. So this is the VR prime. This is the value function derivative. This is the value function derivative for the manufacturer. Now I solve this equation. This is a differential equation, simultaneous. And when I solve it, I get the UM and a UR, and I get a VM and a VR. Because there are different cases here, these cases can be obtained a priori. So I'm going to now give you the solution. So we're going to assume that the value function is linear. And it turns out that we have a theorem that tells you that whatever I'm doing is the optimal solution. And so we have a linear value function here. Given the linear value function, it is easy to solve VR and VM because we can plug that in and they become set of algebraic equations, which are given like here. And so for beta m less than this, the solution, this is the participation rate. Okay. Manufacturer doesn't provide any subsidy, but retailer does. In this one, both of them provide subsidy to each other. In the third setting, manufacturer provides subsidy, but the retailer doesn't. And I solved the problem on all three settings. These are just algebraic equations. They can be solved using numerically very easily. And so here's the numerical analysis. And in numerical analysis, I do one more thing. I add another term, which makes it more general to the Sethi model. And now we solve. So here's the solution. So the solution is obtained totally, but I'm only going to give you the insight, some of the insight into the solution. The paper has many, many, many more figures, but I'm going to give you just one figure. So here's the manufacturer's margin. And you can see that the participation rate of the manufacturer is 0 for a while, and then it up. That says that if manufacturer has a lower margin, then it doesn't care about the sale that much, and it's not going to support the retailer's advertising. But if the manufacturer margin is high, then it supports the retailer's advertising, because by supporting the retailer's advertising, the retailer will advertise more and it will sell more. And because manufacturer high margin, it will profit more. So the retailer is going to be like this. Retailer, on the other hand, will support when his margin is bigger. Okay, so let's quickly look at it. M increases, manufacturer has a greater incentive to advertise more, therefore his support increases. As M increases, retailer knows manufacturer has a higher incentive for advertising, so so his support to manufacturer goes down. That means if M is very high, the retailer doesn't support the manufacturer, because retailer knows that manufacturer will advertise on his own, because it is in self-interest to advertise more. There's no reason to support him. So if M is bigger than R, that happens. If R is bigger than M, then the opposite happens. So this picture actually tells you both stories. Because they are giving money to each other, we can actually see that if M is very high, then the net transfer is from the manufacturer to the retailer. If M is very low, then the net transfer is from the retailer to no manufacturer to retailer. Here, the net transfer is related to the manufacturer. At this particular point, there is no transfer, so the transfer cancel out. In between, there is a transfer both ways, but the net transfer is only from here. That's from R to M. The net transfer from M to R is in this region, and at this point, there is no net transfer between the two. So that's what I will do. It seems to me that I am concluding the paper. So we provide a difference between Nash and Stackelberg games. I'm sorry I went too fast on the second game, but the ideas are the main purpose is to show that we can do two-period supply chain, we can do the coordination, etc. We give you a type of Stackelberg equilibria and a two-period supply chain. There are two kinds of equilibria. There are more in the literature. We give you a definition of a multi-period feedback Stackelberg equilibrium in a general setting. We use this theory to do dynamic pricing and production and supply chain with cost learning. There we also find a revenue sharing contract that coordinates a two-period supply chain. Then we go to a mixed leadership game, and the mixed leadership is basically formulated by me for the first time. Before that, people had a leader-follower game. There was a leader, there was a follower, but I decided that there's no reason for a leader to also not be a follower. And when I did this mixed leadership game, I actually got this idea from my own home, because in my home in India, my sisters, when they come to the marriage age, my mother says to the father, find a husband for the sister. So the mother is a leader in making a decision as to finding the husband. And when it comes to the money, the father will come and say, mother, this is the budget for this year or this month. And the mother will then decide how to use that budget, what to buy, groceries or clothes or shoes or whatever. So you can see that on the budget, the father was a leader, on the other, the mother was a leader. So I said, why not formulate a mixed leadership game mathematically? And so I did that. So I have a number of papers on mixed leadership games. And finally, I used this mixed leadership into an advertising setting and published that paper in Science Journal of Control. So that's a number of papers here. This is a paper on survey of Stackelberg differential games. This is the paper where we do the coordination. These are the paper by other people on differential games. There's a mixed leadership game paper of mine in a math journal, but only open loop solution. That's a paper on SAM control on many different kind of equilibria. So that is a paper that was 2015 paper. Then I gave you this talk on this paper. I gave you talk. So these last two papers are the paper that I covered in this topic. And then we have three echelon supply chain and cooperative advertising, and that is currently under second round review in POM. I'm expecting them to make a decision maybe within 1 or 2 weeks. So I'm hoping for a good decision on that one. And that's a finish of my talk. So I am open to questions. Nancy?
Okay, so thank you, Professor Suresh. Is any questions for Professor Suresh's speech?
Can we go to the full panel where I can see people?
Yeah, you can. You can firstly stop the share screen.
Okay. Stop share? Okay. Good.
Yeah, that's okay. So now,
Hello, everyone.
yeah, actually, no one have the questions. So that's all.